Great. Well, it's not a virtual meeting if there's not some technical problems, right? So happy to do my part. My name is Emily Norton. I'm the Executive Director of the Charles River Watershed Association. I also serve as a Newton City Councilor, and I'm a member of the MMA Environmental Policy Committee. I'm very lucky to have Senator Cream as my own senator, and Senator Roush represents our watershed as well. Thank you so much for holding this hearing and inviting us to be a part of it. Climate and flooding was even on the front page of both the Saturday and Sunday Boston Globes this past weekend. Next slide, please, Garrett. Just some quick background. CRWA was founded in 19... I'm having a echo.
You have an echo.
Yeah, maybe
everybody should mute other than Emily. That might help.
There we go. So we were founded in 1965. We have played a central role in the cleanup of the Charles River ever since. Our work intersects closely with the issue of inland flooding because many of the things that we need to do to further clean up the Charles have the co-benefit of reducing flooding. In fact, we spend a lot of time reminding people that climate change flooding is not just sea level rise and storm surges, but inland flooding as well. So I can say that from my work at CRWA as a city councilor, from my work with fellow local electeds in the MMA, local elected officials need help on this issue, not just money, but also capacity and knowledge. Next slide, please. First, some very quick context. When Europeans first got here, our land was very watery, and you can see that reflected in the names of so many of our communities: Marshfield, Holbrook, Brookline, Swampscott. Europeans basically dried out the land by killing all the beavers that used to create wetlands and by burying, ditching, diverting, or simply filling in streams and wetlands. Next slide, please. Those changes allow us to have the built environment that we have, roads, buildings, etc., parking lots, but they come at a cost. These impermeable surfaces drastically increase the likelihood of flooding, particularly as our stormwater infrastructure was built 50 or 100 years ago, designed for the rainfall of then, not of now. Next slide, please. So here's just a quick reminder of how bad it can get. This is from March 2010 that people probably remember was horrible flooding all over Massachusetts. We were declared a federal disaster area, millions in losses to individuals, the state, and communities. And much of the flooding was in areas that had not flooded before. That's a little foreshadowing. Next slide, please. The point of this slide is to show the difference when you have natural cover on the left, half of the rain goes into the ground. And that's good. When you have a highly urbanized area, 15% goes into the ground. Over half becomes runoff and goes into our stormwater system. This is the problem right here that we are dealing with. Next slide. More impervious cover also means more pollution into the Charles and every other river in our state, because stormwater runoff carries with it all the toxins and pollutants that are on our roads. Next slide, please. So what do we do about it? We need a fundamental and wholesale change in how we manage water and how we build. We need to bring nature back into our built environment in such a way that we hold in water, store water, infiltrate water, so that in these intense rain events, the water does not become weaponized against us. Rain gardens, bioswales, permeable pavement, tree canopy. And in many cases, it means not developing in certain areas and even giving up certain areas that are already developed, as we've been hearing about from previous speakers. Next slide. So in terms of specific recommendations, make decisions based on current climate data. That seems obvious, but we are not doing that. FEMA maps rely on past data, not current or future projections, yet we continue to use them for everything from a single family home to the I-90 project. Yes, this $1 billion plus project is not yet taking climate into account. The state should fund every region or watershed to build its own flood forecasting model. We just did this with MVP funds, and it found that even if we installed 32,000 acres of green stormwater infrastructure, which is close to 20% of the land area in our upper and middle watershed, it would not be enough to bring projected flooding impacts down to present day levels, much less building back better. So our takeaway from this is we really need to be thinking big. To be clear, we believe the solutions will mean a mix of green and traditional gray infrastructure, but the point is that very large scale measures are needed. So for now, the state should fund every region or watershed to produce such a model for themselves. It is so important. How can you plan if you don't even know where the water is going to be? And in terms of existing bills that address this, we strongly support Senator Collins' bill, which would require climate risks be taken into account in development decisions. The Secretary referenced a new tool, the RMAT, that can be a guide, but we need more than guidance. We need requirements. Next slide, please. What else? Other recommendations. The MSBA should stop funding school buildings in former wetlands. Right now, they take a completely hands-off approach when it comes to siting, but they're doling out tens of millions of dollars to cities and towns. They could tie strings to that. In terms of bills we think would be valuable, these two in particular, the Pacheco Peak bill that Linda Arell went into some detail on, so I'm not going to talk about that too much. The Rogers bill is important because right now 40B projects can bypass local wetland regulations. We need more affordable housing, but we are putting vulnerable people more at risk if we put their home in an area likely to flood. Next slide, please. In general, we need to empower local leaders. The MVP program is great. We heard a lot about it earlier, but it needs more money. Project requests outstrip funding. You could direct ARPA funding to it now. We should not make communities compete for it, though. It should be reliable funding like Chapter 90 funds. We should make watershed groups and RPAs eligible for funding. We appreciate that Governor Baker supports doing that and has proposed that. GSI training. We should require every community to have someone trained in green stormwater infrastructure. Your current DPW commissioners, your current, utilities managers. This is not to, disparage anyone, but if you went to school 20 or 30 years ago, you weren't trained in any of this stuff. So how can we expect people to be making good decisions if they're not even trained in it? The MS4 permit, that's a mandate on cities and towns to reduce pollution in their waterways. The solutions will also reduce flooding. We need to increase funding to DEP and also to watershed groups to better support cities and towns in compliance. In fact, CRWA is doing this right now through a Mass DEP grant. EPA has proposed a stormwater permit that would require large property owners with large areas of impermeable surface to get their own stormwater permit. That would take the pressure off of cities and towns. It would be great if the state would express support for that. Next slide, please. Tie strings. So the Green Communities Program is such a great program because it says, you want this money? You got to do these things. You got to pass the stretch code. You got to buy fuel efficient vehicles, et cetera, et cetera. And in return, you get these funding. There are so many ways that the state doles out money to cities and towns that strings could be attached to in a way to compel and incentivize action. The MVP program, MSBA, as I mentioned, Complete Streets program is not really complete because it does not really address reducing flooding as you're making changes to streets. Chapter 90, you could tie strings to that. I'm sure there are other programs that I'm not even familiar with. In terms of what sort of strings could be attached, again, require GSI certification on staff and have the state pay for it. Require passage of a local stormwater utility. Require that locally owned dams no longer in use be removed because breached dams are an incredible danger to communities. You could have cities and towns be required to pass wetlands ordinances or tree ordinances. There's many things you could do to tie strings to funding. Next slide, please. I'll end with the biggest nature-based solution success story that you've never heard of. So back in the 50s, there was massive hurricanes. In fact, the names Connie and Diane have been retired, devastated the eastern seaboard. The Army Corps considered in the Charles River watershed another dam and levees, spending over $100 million. Instead, what they did, you can go to the next slide, is they spent $8.3 million just buying up land, not contiguous, but in 16 communities. If you drive around, and you might have even seen these signs already and maybe didn't even know what it meant, the Natural Valley storage area holds billions of gallons of rain and prevents it from, and releases it slowly. So prevents flooding from downstream communities that have been kept safer ever since this has been built or constructed, and no one's even familiar with it. That is the level that we need to be acting on again. Last slide. My favorite climate change quote. That is all for me. Thank you so much.
I guess that concludes our resilience against inland flooding. I have a couple of questions and others might, so just one second. So somebody started talking about it, but what incentives could the state use that would discourage cities and towns from allowing development in future flood plans? Anybody want to jump in on that?
A free one would be to make it uninsurable, honestly.
Okay.
That's the nuclear option, but that is very difficult. I also think that something that Linda Arell said would be very valuable. If people could extract their retirement savings from their houses by being able to be bought out of harm's way, that would be very helpful. A lot of these places were not in harm's way when they built the houses, but they are increasingly so.
Okay. So do the existing laws or regulations pose, did you want to say something, Linda? No. Do the existing laws or regulations pose obstacles to implementing nature-based resilience projects? And how can we amend regulations to provide greater flexibility?
So I covered that a little bit. I didn't talk about, in the interest of time, I held back on some things, but the state is updating its stormwater handbook for the first time since 1997. So there's an opportunity there. As I mentioned, making sure that we're not relying on FEMA maps, but we're actually relying on updated data. The secretary referenced the RMAT tool, which is, I can't remember what RMAT stands for, but it's a new tool to sort of have a updated climate lens. And that should be more than just a guide, but should be a requirement. It's just too easy now. And the Concoms, you have volunteers who do yeoman's and yo-woman's and yo-person's work, but these are volunteers, and they're making what's going to be turning into life and death decisions about where development is allowed. And so they need more tools, and maybe some of those decisions should not be in their purview. I'm seeing, even as a city councilor, more developments are being approved where the new home is raised. And so the neighbors are now experiencing flooding and basement issues that they weren't before. And, so there's still things that are allowed to be done that shouldn't be allowed.
Okay, thank you.
I would add,
yes,
could I add just real quickly?
Sure.
The Wetlands Protection Act is incredibly important, and we strongly support it. And it's also very difficult to expand wetlands such that water flows into wetlands instead of into people's basement and into infrastructure. We'd like to see something where you could put a constructed wetland upstream to filter water, and then be able to expand existing wetlands in order to store more water. As we're getting these intense rainfalls and then flash droughts, it needs to be much, much easier to expand the wetlands we have. And that's currently a barrier.
Okay, thank you.
I think finally, being a home rule state, we just really have to tackle how we are going to work regionally at a watershed scale level when each town has its own zoning, each town has its own processes. And so that's going to be something that, if we're very serious about that, we're going to have to think regionally and watershed scale.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely.
Does anyone have a question? Okay, hearing.
Madam Chair.
Yeah, if you text me.
Yeah, just
if you
yeah, I don't have access. Thank you, Senator. I don't have access to the texting function. But here's first of all, I want to thank this panel for a terrific set of testimony. I do detect one contradiction a little bit, local empowerment versus regional empowerment. And I wonder how you'd reconcile the two. The Cape Cod Commission is an example, the only example really in the state where we went regional and transferred some powers out of local governments. How can we accomplish the transformative work for Greater Boston that you're referencing if we focus on empowering local governments only? Do we need a kind of Greater Boston analog to the Cape Cod Commission? That seems to be where some of your observations are going.
Senator, you hit the nail on the head. We have a local, I'll just mention, we have a very strong home rule attitude in this state and culture. And yet, if local communities aren't aware of what to do, if there's financial reasons that you'd rather keep developing to get the property tax revenues, even though that puts your own community further at risk. So Julie mentioned that we perhaps should have an MWRA related to flooding and stormwater. The work she's doing with the Resilient Mystic is terrific. We have something called the Charles River Climate Compact, and the flood model that I talked about was a project of the Charles River Climate Compact, where cities and towns are coming together to do this data. Even if they wanted to get to Senator Cream's question, even if they wanted to take actions, you don't know where the flooding is going to be. They don't even have that data now. So you got to get the data first, build these models. It was like $400,000. It was not, it's not going to break the bank for 15 communities, or in our case, it's 35 communities in the city, in the Charles River watershed. But I had a conversation, I organized a conversation with the MSBA leadership last week with a bunch of local officials who were saying, we think you should tie strings to MSBA funding, that new schools should only be net zero and should not be built in flood zones. And that is a way that you could get cities and towns. If you say you can't have access to tens of millions of dollars in new school funding unless you follow these rules, then cities and towns would do it. So I think there are ways we can do it without changing our whole culture, because Lord knows we don't have time to do that. That would be my view.
And I think, adding on to what you just said, I'll be quick. I think if we try to do something as bold as the Cape Cod Commission that really is affecting all sorts of development, that we'd have a huge fight. And that's why I think something where, like the Mass Water Resources Authority, which is totally focused on drinking water and wastewater, but add to it stormwater flooding, where they have a regional capacity and towns have the retail capacity. I think that's the right model.
Where are you going?
So it's really much more about enabling engineering and capital projects.
Oh yeah.
Thank you both.
Again,
good thoughts.
Yeah, it's right there in Newton Center. I know what you mean. Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yep. Senator Cream, you're muted.
Madam Chair, you're on mute.
Okay, it mutes, it unmutes. I'm unmuted now. Okay. Thank you all very much. Great presentation. I have